Welcome. Thanks for joining us for First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. I'm Bill Benson, and I have hosted First Person for the past 25 years. Each month, we share firsthand accounts of survival during the Holocaust. Each of our first person guests is a volunteer at the museum. Please send us any question you have and let us know where you are watching from in the live chat. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Frank Cohn share his firsthand account of survival with us today. Frank, thank you for agreeing to be our first person.
Thank you.
Frank, we're going to start because you have so much to share with us in our very short hour. You were born in 1925, and in August, you will celebrate your 100th birthday. You are from Breslau, Germany, which is now Wrocław, Poland. Before we turn to the Holocaust and the Second World War, please tell us about your parents, Martin and Ruth, and your first few years growing up in Germany.
Well, I came from a middle-class Jewish family, and I was the only son. Here you see my mother and father and my canary bird. We were very comfortable. My parents had a sporting goods store, and that earned them a nice living. We had a sleeping maid, and when I came along, we hired another girl to take care of me. And I had a lot of German playmates that I played with in the sandbox, for example. So everything was, as you might say, honky-dory.
Mm-hmm. Frank, you described to me that your parents had what you referred to as a sort of arranged marriage. Can you say more about that?
Yes, both of them were uh, brought up in the area of Posen, which became Poznan, and because the Polish borders were moved, and uh, when they didn't want to become Polish, and they moved to Breslau, and there's where my mother was introduced to my father, but there was a 14-year difference in their ages, and it wasn't a romantic wedding that they had. But they did work together, and yet they had separate groups of friends, for example. So everything was quiet. It was never any upheavals that I experienced.
Frank, was your family religiously observant?
My father was religious. Every Saturday, for example, we had to walk to the synagogue, which was about a half an hour walk away, because on the Sabbath we weren't supposed to ride. So you can give a way of assessing the religiosity. We my mother was always upstairs in the temple because women and men were not allowed to sit together in the synagogue.
Mm-hmm.
So I learned to be Orthodox, but that changed when my father died and my mother was not that religious.
Mhm, mhm. Frank, in the 1920s, the Nazis were a small, radical fringe political movement that was attempting to seize power in Germany and regularly engaged in street violence. Your uncle Max was attacked by a group of Nazis in 1927. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, he was in the city of Chemnitz, which was away from our city, and he was accosted by a number of uniformed Nazis. And when they confirmed that he was Jewish, they killed him. And then there was a process of attempting to do justice in the judicial system. And by the time that I became more knowledgeable a number of years later, there was still discussion about this, and I overheard them, and I understood that Nazis did not like Jews, and they had to be feared. And this became even more prominent when One day I looked out of the window, of course, where there was a finance office which pulled in demonstrators, and there were two groups that were fighting each other. And I asked my parents, what's going on? And they did sit down and explain to me one group were communists and one group were Nazis, and they didn't like each other, and we didn't like either one of them.
Mhm. Frank, before we go on, I'd like you to know that there are people watching and listening to you today from around the country and, in fact, around the world. So I want to welcome our viewers who are in Delaware, Ohio, California, and Wisconsin, and other states, and also welcome our international viewers. For example, we have people with us today from Denmark and Canada. Thank you all for watching us today. Frank, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power in 1933. You were just 7 years old. Can you share some of your first memories for us of that time?
Well, the thing that was mostly in my mind is that suddenly all the kids that I used to play with in the sandbox disappeared and nobody showed up. And I asked my parents, what's going on? How come all my friends are gone? And then they explained me that their parents probably didn't want their kids play with some Jewish kid, and that this was all part of the Nazi problem. And that was the end of my playing in the sandbox, because there was nobody to play with.
One of the things you shared with me is that there was clearly fear in the Jewish community, and you avoided places where Nazis assembled.
Oh, absolutely. We stayed away from that all the time, and there was the ability then to pull together within the Jewish community, and that's the way we started to move on after Hitler I came into power. Yes.
And shortly after he came into power, your father sold his store. Tell us why he chose to sell it at that time, and then what did he do to be able to support his family?
Well, it was very shortly after Hitler came to power that there were demonstrators of Nazis in uniform with signs that indicated that the Germans should not buy from Jews. And my father recognized that this was going to be a losing proposition. And he sold the store as quickly as he could and with as much money as he could gain from selling it. And of course, that assisted us in the subsequent years. And my father then had to get another way of earning a living, and they ended up. My parents worked together on this to sell bales of cloth to tailors and others who needed cloth to do their particular jobs, and this went on for a number of years.
Yeah. Frank, just tell us about this photograph, and I, I believe our viewers can have a ability to see what it actually says in English, but tell us about this.
Well, it's a little hard to read, I guess.
Well,
But
actually, I think
the
we have it.
Germans were not going to buy from the Jews who are just a disaster for them. And I guess it's in English down there.
Yeah.
German, defend yourself against the Jewish atrocity propaganda. Only buy from Germans in the stores. Yeah.
And because your father had to find a new way of earning a living, as you described, that obviously also affected his income, and you had to change your homes.
Well, things, of course, got worse as the years went on, and there was a misconception by the Germans by the German Jews, who always saw that there was more laws that came out against them, and they always looked at those and said, well, yes, now this is it, but it can't get any worse. And of course, it got worse all the time. And 1935 was the year where laws were passed that absolutely segregated the Jews from the Germans. And we had to let go of our live-in maid, for example, and there was nobody, and my parents couldn't sell any cloths to any Germans anymore, only to the Jews, and this became a problem too.
Frank, tell us about your experience in the second grade and your teacher, Herr Schubert.
Well, my first grade teacher, I don't remember much, but I thought he was terribly old. He was at least 50. But my second grade teacher was a young fella who was very energetic, and I really liked him, and I kind of thought he liked me too, and everything was working beautifully in school. And then I heard that he was going to come back to us in the third grade, and I was all excited to see him again. And when he came in in full Nazi uniform, and my heart just dropped. And of course, pretty soon the kids also ended up in the Hitler Youth and brought some paraphernalia from the Hitler Youth into the class. But anyway, Herr Schubert, that was his name, wanted order in the class, and he didn't permit anybody to pick on me. But there was an obvious difference here when they sang their Nazi songs, that they all had to stand up at attention while I was instructed to stay seated because I was not allowed to participate in Nazi songs. And of course, the kid who is sitting while everybody else is standing will not be much of a popular kid in class. And I ended up as an outcast.
And here we see you, that same class you're describing, the class picture, and right below you is Herr Schubert in his uniform.
Yes, there he is.
One of the things you said to me, Frank, was that he didn't let people bother you in class. He tried to maintain order, but one of the things you said, it was different after school, where he didn't have that control.
Yes, they started to pick on me and started to call me names. And then one day they actually started to chase me, but I was a pretty good runner and I was able to evade them. And I got home okay. And when I told my parents what had happened, they knew they had to take some action. And they then arranged that I would terminate my attendance in the public schools and attend the Jewish private school from then on. And I was certainly more comfortable there.
Tell us a little bit more about that experience once you moved over to the Jewish private school.
Well, of course, I integrated more, and I was immediately accepted, and I could, I didn't have that inferiority complex that I had gained in the public school. So it was a good thing for me, but I was still intimidated by the girls in the class because I was the only son, the only child, and my cousins were either too old or too young, and I had no experience of dealing with girls. So in that respect, I was still uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Frank, throughout the 1930s, the Nazi regime implemented, more and more anti-Jewish restrictions. For example, excluding Jews from many aspects of public life, from having membership in organizations, working in certain professions. You described a little bit about what it did for your family's business. What were some of the other impacts of all those restrictions on Jews as it affected you and your family?
Well, of course, first of all, we had to let go of our sleeping maid because Germans were not allowed to work for Jews anymore. And as my parents were not allowed to sell their clothes to German manufacturers. And we kept pulling in closer to the Jewish community. And then after um, afterwards, we couldn't even go to restaurants anymore because they all had signs that said that Jews were not desired. We just become completely separated from the German society as as long as it were. But when we were out in the streets, my parents always said, "Behave, behave, behave," and that was drilled into me, and I knew that it was dangerous if I started to act up and drew attention to us. We would be pointed out as Jews, and this might become a real problem.
We've got another photo. Please tell us about this one.
Oh, this was, I guess, just before my bar mitzvah. Uh, so I must have been about 12 years old, and I'm playing with one of my friends, Peter Friedlander. And this is just an indicator that all my friends had to be Jewish because there was nobody on the German side to play with.
Frank, you mentioned this was just before your bar mitzvah. Even though this was such an extraordinarily difficult time for you and your family, you were able to celebrate your bar mitzvah, which is a Jewish ritual signifying adult responsibilities, when you turned 13 years old. Tell us about that. That was a major occasion for you.
Yes, it was. As a matter of fact, I had to practice quite a number of times beforehand, and then I had to chant the certain prayers. And with all the practice and so forth, I must have done pretty well. And I got all kinds of presents for my birthday. I got a BMW bicycle, and goodness knows how many pen and pencil sets because people didn't know what else to give me. I didn't know what to do with all of them. But I was real happy with the whole occasion until the occasion was over and my father pulled me aside and he said that he had now difficulties to be economically able to support the family and that he had to do something completely different. And he was going to go to the United States to get an affidavit, which is a document that invites you to immigrate to the United States with a proviso that you should never become a burden to the government. And off he went because he had some distant relatives in the States. So he took a visitor's visa to go.
And I want you to continue on that. But before you do, Frank, I want to do two things. I want to remind our audience to please share your questions for Frank in the chat. So please do that. And we have a comment and a question that has come in from one of our viewers already. So this viewer says, I want to bring in a question, Paula as the viewer, and she says, what influenced your parents' decision to leave Germany as early as 1938 before so many atrocities happened? And then she adds to that a comment, so many people wanted to wait it out, but I'm glad many were brave enough to leave ahead of time. So really, what was the deciding factor, do you think, for your father?
Well, of course, it was that he was losing more and more customers because he was only able to sell them to Jewish people, and more of the Jews started to recognize that it was impossible to stay in Germany, and they started to immigrate. So he was losing customers right and left, and that's when he decided he had to do something else. And he
Mhm.
got himself a visitor's visa to go look for these distant relatives that had immigrated to the States many years beforehand. And my my father, with a visitor's visa, was only able to take one suitcase and 10 marks. That is what visitors were allowed to take out of the country from Germany, and
And, and
which meant
10
he was
mark 10 marks would have been equivalent to what?
oh, 10 marks was certainly not even $10 worth.
Not even
It was
$10.
$2.50 for the 10 marks, which obviously weren't going to last him very long. So he was at the mercy of the Jewish Relief Organization.
Mhm. And was he able to locate those distant relatives?
Yes, he did. But there was a depression in the United States, and they were not in the position to offer him an affidavit. And he thought that was a real dilemma. And he decided to stay longer to see if he could find somebody else to give him an affidavit. And that was a very lucky thing.
Yeah. And Frank, of course, while your father's doing that, you and your mother remained in Germany. You tell us about the frightening encounter you and your mother had at your apartment in Breslau, and then about your parents' friend, Mr.
Yeah,
Michaelius.
this was in September uh, of the year 1943, and two Gestapo agents came to our door, and they indicated they wanted to talk to my father, and my mother said, "Well, he's on an international trip right now," and she was instructed that uh, the minute he returned, he had to report to Gestapo headquarters. And that raised a red light in her mind. And I understood it too because I knew what this was all about because of a business acquaintance of our parents by the name of Michaelis. Um, he was told to report to Gestapo headquarters. And a few hours later, they found him on the sidewalk in front of the building. He was dead. He had either been pushed or jumped out of a third story window. And that is what came to mind.
And Frank, during this time, which I think was this was 1938 still, a woman named Mrs. Griffith.
Yes,
Sho-
1938, right.
yeah, Mrs. Griffith showed up on your doorstep. Tell us about her and what how her presence impacted your life.
Well, it was a couple of days later after the Gestapo came, this Mrs. Griffith came to the door with an official document that indicated that we had to provide her with a bedroom in our apartment. And my mother pulled me aside and said, "Now, this is a Gestapo informant, so you've got to be very careful what you say when you're in here. And when we have something important, we'll have to go outside on a little walk or something, and we can discuss it at that point." But this Mrs. Griffith really was British. She provided me with 2 English lessons. And I didn't realize at the time how important that was going to be later on.
Mhm. Uh, So your mother, she had no doubt this was Mrs. Griffith was an informant that had been placed in the house. Right.
Yes, she knew that immediately and explained it to me. Yes.
So how did your mother then make the arrangements for the two of you to get out of Germany?
Well, it was a week or so, a couple of weeks later, that she said, "Let's go for a walk." And I knew immediately this was important. So we went outside, and she turned to me and asked me, "Should we go?" And I knew immediately what she meant. Should we flee to the United States where my father was? Now, I had good reasons to stay where I was. All my friends were in in Germany, in Breslau, and I liked my school, my Jewish private school. I was comfortable in that, and all my relatives were still there. So, and I had my BMW bicycle. So I really wanted to stay in many ways, but I was smart enough to understand that we were not wanted in that country. And I said to my mother, let's go. And that was probably the smartest thing I ever did in my whole life, because a 13-year-old kid who doesn't want to go can put in all kinds of obstacles and could have delayed the departure, and that might have been fatal.
That's such an important point. There you are, just 13 years old. Just if your mother had had to deal with you being reluctant to go and fighting that decision, would have made everything for her that much harder. So you're right. That was an incredibly smart and brilliant thing on your part to know that that's the right thing to do. Tell us about the next photos that we have here, Frank.
Well, my mother went to the consulate in Breslau and got herself a visitor's visa, same document that my father had gotten. And it was lucky they didn't have computers, because if they had realized that my father was already in country, they would not have given us a visa, since we would have been designated as refugees and not as visitors. And now it was lucky that she got the visa, and it was also lucky that I was on her passport. So she went out of her way, completely out of character, the next day and bribed somebody in the consulate to extend the visa to include me. That said, and with Franz. Franz was my first name in those days, and I was glad to get rid of that the minute I got to the States.
And as this document shows, there's your name circled on the right-hand side. So once your mom had the visas for the two of you and you could go together, how did the two of you actually get out of Germany?
Well, first of all, she made arrangements ahead of time, and you could do that. You could pay for everything that you could arrange in Breslau. She got first class passage on Holland America line, and she got first class hotel reservations 2 weeks in New York and paid for that. But when we left with only one suitcase each and 10 marks each, and left everything else behind, which was a very heroic thing for my mother to do at that point. Never looked back. It just walked out, and we snuck out really at 5 o'clock in the morning so that Mrs. Griffith would not hear us. Got on a train to Berlin, where she said goodbye to her father and her eldest sister. Her father perished in the Holocaust, in a concentration camp just a while later, and my aunt was able to escape to Australia, but she never saw her sister again because Australia was just too far. We didn't have the money to get together again.
And I think you shared with me that you and your mother made your way to Amsterdam to say goodbye to other relatives before you took a ship for the U.S.
Yes, she had a cousin who had escaped to Holland, which was obviously not a good place to escape to. When we said goodbye to them, we didn't know that in 1939, 1 year later, the Germans would march in, and they end up in a concentration camp. Now, by some miracle, the two, Kurt Josephson and his wife Fanny, survived, but their son David did not survive. He was a 13-year-old kid just like me. He was put into a field with about 100 other kids, and they didn't get any food and they didn't get any clothing because it was winter time. And they either froze to death or starved to death. One died after another, and of course, the boy died in that field.
From there, Frank, you and your mother made it to the United States, arriving on October 30th, 1938. Tell us about the journey and your arrival in New York City.
Well, of course, I had a wonderful time as a first-class passenger on the liner Staatendam, and I almost was a ping pong champion, but at the last minute somebody beat me. But my mother had a terrible trip, not because of the accommodations, because she was worried about what would happen in Ellis Island. She had learned about Ellis Island, where they interrogated everybody coming in. And if they discovered that my father was already in country, we would be put on the next boat going back to Germany. And goodness knows what would happen if we get back to Germany under these circumstances. Anyway, I was all prepared to get into the New York Harbor because my gym teacher had told me all about the skyscrapers and the Statue of Liberty and what it meant. And I had my box camera and I was taking pictures. I took that particular picture, as a matter of fact.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then an announcement came over the speaker that said, all first-class passengers are invited to go through customs and then directly onto the dock. We did not have to go to Ellis Island, and my mother was much relieved, and she thought that now everything was in good shape, and we had a wonderful reunion with my father, but he said everything isn't right yet because we're at the mercy of the Jewish relief organizations, and they had indicated that once I had an affidavit, I had to go back to Germany to await the invitation to immigrate. And of course, that would have been a real problem. So we were in a quandary at that point.
And I know that that's quite a remarkable thing that got you out of that quandary, right?
Yeah, well, what happened, of course, was we ended up in New York on the 30th of October, 1938, and then on the 10th of November or the 9th of November, the Crystal Night was implemented, a pogrom against the Jews in Germany, and this was a terrible disaster for the Jews. They burned the synagogues. They smashed all the windows of all the remaining Jewish shops, and they arrested every male that they could get their hands on who was a Jew. And when we read about it in the papers in New York, we really worried about all our relatives that we had left behind. And of course, there was just no contact that we could reestablish at that point. And but the irony of the whole thing was that this was an occasion. All the terrible things that happened against all the Jews in Germany, for us, it became a saving grace because President Roosevelt issued an executive order that indicated that nobody would be forced to return to Germany, which meant our visas were extended indefinitely, and we were saved.
Mm. That night that you talked about, the night of broken glass, November 9th through 10th, 1938, known as Kristallnacht. So the effect of it ultimately for you was to allow you to be able to remain in the United States. And you said that you had no contact, so you did not know at the time what had happened to family members as a result of Kristallnacht.
That's right. We were without news, and then we were a little bit afraid to write to them because we didn't know whether that exposed them to some additional problems. So the communication was completely disestablished.
Hmm. So Frank, here you are now. Your parents are feeling more secure about their ability to stay, and your mother enrolled you in the seventh grade. Tell us what you remember about attending school in those early days for you in the United States.
Well, it was an eye opener. Now, remember, I had two lessons of English that didn't go very far, and I went from the German seventh grade to the American seventh grade, and I was uh, pretty far ahead in some subjects like math and geography and some others. And so they put me in a rabbit class, but the big problem was English. And I found that out on the first day because the teacher wanted me to get acquainted with all the kids and said, Frank, take that waste paper basket and take it around and collect the trash. I had no idea what she was talking about, but she had looked at the window. And I said, she wants me to open the window. So I opened the window. And of course, everybody laughs. Well, of course, a kid who's got laughed at doesn't want to be in that position. And I knew I had to learn English as quickly as possible. Now, the teachers helped me a bit. They got magazines and wrote, annotated what was the name of the various objects that were depicted in those pictures that were in the magazines. And I listened to the radio, but the radio was difficult. You couldn't understand what the story was all about, but I could get the intonations and I could avoid the German accent that I recognized that I didn't want right from the beginning. So I practiced imitating what I heard over the radio. And then finally, I went to the movies. And the movies are what helped me most in getting English training. I could understand what was going on because it was showed, and I could figure out what the words were. And I learned English even though it was 10 cents for every movie. But I was very lucky. Somebody arranged for me to participate in a Time magazine type of activity. They had a movie that was shown before every major movie. Time Marches On. It was a newsreel, and they tried to reestablish what happened in Germany with a blackboard and two Jewish kids with their heads hanging down because on the blackboard said, the Jews are our disaster for the Germans. And for that 5 minutes, I received $100. Well, somebody was trying to help a refugee kid, and that $100 was able to buy a heck of a lot of 10-cent movie tickets.
When you think that 10 cents was significant out of the $2.50 they were allowed to take, $100 was a fortune for you in that regard.
Absolutely.
And Frank, while you were rapidly learning English, as you described, how about your parents? Tell us what their adjustment was like once they came here.
Well, of course, at first, they were not allowed to work as visitors. And we were able, with the little money we got from the relief organization, to rent or sublet a bedroom with kitchen privileges from a Greek family. And the minute then, when my parents got the authority to work, we were able to move out into a sub-basement apartment, sort of, but it was our own. And uh, anyway, my father got a job with the Eagle Pencil Company to run their stock room, and my mother had trained herself to make hats, so she did millinery work, and that is what helped us move into our own unit.
Mhm. Frank, the United States entered the war following the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. You graduated from high school in June 1943, and soon after your 18th birthday, you were drafted into the United States Army. Will you tell us about being sworn in as a U.S. citizen during basic training?
Well, I was drafted 1 month after my 18th birthday, and I went to Fort Dix, New Jersey. That was the reception center. People usually stayed there 4 days and then get orders to go to basic training. Everybody got their orders except me. I went to my sergeant. I said, "How come I didn't get orders?" He said, "Let me check." He came back. "You're an enemy alien." "I'm an enemy alien." "Yes, you were born in Germany. Your last passport was German. You never were naturalized. You were a visitor, and the Germans are the enemy. So when they regard you as German, you have to be investigated by the FBI." So I had to stay for 3 months in the reception center, and then I got clearance from the FBI, obviously, because I got orders to Fort Benning, Georgia. And 2 weeks after I ended up in Fort Benning, Georgia, they took me to Columbus, Georgia, to a federal district court. And that's where I was sworn in as a U.S. citizen. And I was very proud of that. I patted myself on the back because nobody else was there to do that. And I felt wonderful because I shed that nasty moniker of enemy alien. I was now an American citizen. I was now like everybody else, and I felt just great.
Frank, and then not long after that, you left for the U.S. You left the U.S. for England as an infantry replacement soldier in September 1944, and you were soon sent to France and Belgium. And then shortly after that, you were assigned to an intelligence unit. Tell us about your training for work in this intelligence unit and about this photograph. Yeah.
This looks a little bit different than I look right now, but that's life for you. Anyway,
See the same person, Frank. Yeah.
well, I was in Belgium when they finally discovered that I spoke German. So they sent me back near Paris to a 2 week course in intelligence. And when I got out there, I was a fully trained intelligence agent. And I know I shed my rank and I only wore US. And I joined a team that was called IPW Team Number 66, Interrogator Prisoner of War Team. They had 2 officers and 2 interpreters who wore no rank, only US. And then we had a driver and a non-commissioned officer in charge who wore their rank. And the driver, by the way, was outranking me. He was a specialist, but he didn't know it. And when I went out with him, I always ordered him around, and he thought I outranked him. Anyway, that's how it went, and I was pulled out to quickly join this team, and we moved to Luxembourg, where we met up with a larger intelligence unit called T-Force, Task Force 12th Army Group, that had the mission to go into the big cities as soon as they were conquered by the infantry. And we had targets, dossiers for building targets and personality targets. Building targets, anything that was of use to the occupying force, which was going to be us, of course. And then the personality targets were war criminals. So anything that was in support of the prosecution of war criminals was included in the building targets as well. The war criminals were the people who were going to be prosecuted as war trial.
And Frank, I want to be sure that before we go on, that before the occupation really began, once you were there, I want to be sure that we talk about your involvement in the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16th, 1944, the German military launched what we call the Battle of the Bulge, and it was a last-ditch military counteroffensive against the Allied armies in the West, and you found yourself in that battle. We have footage of U.S. soldiers during the Battle of the Bulge. And Frank, describe what we're seeing here.
Well, of course, you see shooting that was going to go on, but the worst part of that Battle of the Bulge, for me, for example, was the weather. Look at all that snow there. Well, it wasn't just the snow on the ground; it was also coming down, and it was coming down either as freezing rain or as snow, and we were just miserable because what we had to do was move around in Belgium with a windshield down and the draft of that wind coming across. You couldn't shoot through a windshield. That's why you had to put it down. And I was always in the back seat as a lower enlisted, and I was able to get behind the captain, and he got the worst of the blast, but I never told him that he was protecting me. But I had enough of the residual draft to still be as miserable as everybody else. And so when somebody says Battle of the Bulge, the only thing that comes to my mind was not the firing of any weapons, but the weather.
And Frank, while we're at it, tell us about your very first night during the Battle of the Bulge.
Well, that was probably the most frightening night that I experienced ever. Because not so much that we were in danger of getting killed by firing, it was the rumors that were going around, and the jobs that I got, for example, was to guard a access road into our headquarters. And I had orders, don't let any Germans come in. And they gave me a rifle and they gave me a flashlight, and that's it. So I stood in the middle of the road, and the first vehicle came. I said, halt. And the driver says, what the hell are you doing there? I said, I'm making sure you're not a German. He said, if I were a German, you'd be dead. Get in the ditch over there. And I thought that was such a bad idea. I got in the ditch, and the next vehicle that came, I yelled, halt, halt. They didn't hear me. Went right by. I'm not doing my job. So up and down and up and down. I didn't know what the heck to do. And finally, and there was firing all around us, but there really was nobody there to fire at. So we don't know who they were firing at, but all this mushed in with the rumors that were going in about parachutists and whatnot. None of it was true, but we didn't know that. Anyway, at midnight, everything stopped. We were told to get back at headquarters and move out on a blackout move. And I was lucky I was not a driver, because in the blackout move, there were only slits in front that was visible instead of headlights. And if you lost the vehicle in front of you, you really lost everybody behind you as well. So there was a lot of pressure to be very close to the vehicle in front. And we were on the road towards Antwerp, but of course we never got to Antwerp, and neither did the Germans, because Antwerp, which we didn't know, was the target of the bulge, and neither the Germans nor us got to Antwerp. We got to Namur, and that's where we got orders to see if we could intercept any German infiltrators who had come through our lines in American uniforms, 4 to a Jeep. And that was the mission that we had, to drive all around Belgium. And that's where I experienced all that cold for an entire week, until the skies cleared and our planes came over, and we cheered the planes because we knew that was going to change the battle into our favor. And so it did. And that was the end of our experience. Oh, by the way, we saw one of the infiltrators in a Jeep. The 4 of them had been blasted at a roadblock by the infantry, and they were scattered. The Jeep was on the side, and the 4 dead bodies were in the field. And we searched them. It happened about a half an hour before we got there, and all we could find was dog tags, and we did find explosives and maps, but there were nothing of intelligence value except the dog tags that were either captured POWs or they were dead GIs.
Frank, we have a question from one of our viewers, Kay. Kay asks, what did it feel like going back to fight the Nazis after escaping them?
Well, actually, it felt very good because I was no longer a refugee. I was in charge. And when we had German prisoners, they had to stand at attention in front of us. Of course, they didn't know what my rank was. And I recall, for example, one prisoner in Frankfurt that we had, and he stood at attention. He was a major general, and here he was at attention in front of a Jewish young boy of 19 years old who was of no rank, with just the PFC, but he didn't know that. And then I asked him his name, and he said, August Wilhelm von Hohenzollern. And I knew Hohenzollern was the aristocracy. And I knew when he said August Wilhelm, this was Prince Auvi, the crown prince of the Kaiser. And I stopped the interrogation at that point, went back to my captain and said, we got a big one here. And that was the last contact I had with Prince Auvi.
That is an amazing story you just told. Of course, Frank, I wish we had the entire rest of the afternoon to hear about the things that you were able to do as in the intelligence unit, but you continued to serve in that capacity in Europe, and even stayed after the war in 1940. After the war ended in 1945. In the little time we have left, tell us about the work that you were assigned to do to help support the prosecution of war criminals, besides identifying the Crown Prince.
I was in an intelligence center after the war ended at Oberursel near Frankfurt, and I had to go through Frankfurt to the other side to Fechenheim, where I found a squad of German prisoners of war that was dedicated to me for the arrangements of making boxes. And I got these documents that were placed in the boxes and shipped back to the States for further analysis. And this was in support of the prosecution of war criminals and also of reestablishing how the German army operated. All those documents were being shipped back, and I was in charge of that operation. I ended up being a staff sergeant and ended up doing this for an entire year until I finally had enough points to get back to the States.
And Frank, this photograph just shows the kind of volume of documents that you were assembling to ship back to the U.S.
Yes, it was a full-time job every day, going through Frankfurt and meeting the POWs, and we sent back innumerable number of boxes.
Frank, we have a video question from a student, Serafina. Let's go ahead and listen to Serafina.
Hi, my name is Serafina and I'm from Vienna, Virginia. Did your time in the military change your perspective of the Holocaust? And if it did, how so?
This question for you, Frank, is did your time in the military change your perspective on the Holocaust?
Well, in a way, it probably didn't, because I really didn't have a full understanding of the complete aspects of the Holocaust. I had gotten word from my mother to look for from her sister, and I was able to get to Berlin with a mission with the documents, and I went to the Red Cross to find out if they had any information, and they did. They had lists that indicated she was taken prisoner to Theresienstadt, and then later there was another list that showed she was evacuated to Auschwitz, and there was nobody and she was not on a list of the people who were liberated from Auschwitz, which meant she met her death in Auschwitz. And I knew that and sent that back to my mother. But I also had known about the concentration camps before I even left Germany, now fleeing from there. As a 13-year-old kid, there was graffiti all over the place that said KITZ, and that meant Jews into the concentration camp. Now, nobody knew exactly what happened in the concentration camps, but we knew that that was not a place to go to. And then there were ashes that were sent to the survivors who recognized that the person was killed in the camp. So you knew that people were killed there. All this was known right along, but we didn't know that this was an action that was planned out as to how to gas as many Jews that they could get their hands on, and that had been decided in a bureaucratic way. And the extent of that is something I didn't appreciate until I got back to the States, where all this was then newsworthy.
Frank, ultimately, I know that you were able to learn what happened to the family members that were in Germany. Each spring, the museum leads the nation in remembering the survivors and honoring the victims of the Holocaust. These are what we call, these are congressionally mandated days of remembrance. And you've said in the past that it is really important to remember the names of the victims of the Holocaust, many of whom have no one to remember them. As we close today's program, would you mind reading the names of your family members with us so we can join you in remembering them?
Yes, I lost 5 members on my mother's side and 6 members of my father's side. So 11 close relatives were killed in the Holocaust. And numbers don't mean anything. The Germans recognized that. That's why they tattooed numbers on people. They became nameless. They were only numbers. But when we look back, we got to remember their names. And we had them, Rhea Cohn, Richard, and Jenny Brother, and Hugo, and Berta Brother, and Max, and Elsa Berdas, and Saul Puttelsinger, and Herman David, and David Josephson. Those were all my relatives.
Frank, thank you for doing that for us very much. Frank, thank you for being our first person today. I know, like everybody who's viewing, we could have spent a whole lot more time with you today. I would like our audience to know that Frank's military service did not end after working on the helping with the prosecution of war criminals in 1945 and 1946. He went on to have a very, very long and distinguished career in the U.S. military, and today still is very much remembered and associated with the U.S. Army in a lot of different capacities. So, Frank, thank you for doing this for us today.
Well, thank you for attending it, and I wish all of you well, and farewell.
I'd like to take a moment to thank our donor. First Person is made possible through the generous support of the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation. And I'd also like to invite you to come back and join us again for our next First Person program in May. Thank you all for being with us today.